As a former Marine Corps officer concerned about the future of this nation, on Memorial Day, I want to address the issue of the Second Amendment and the politics of gun control, because we're in an unprecedented situation where the Democratic Party is stage managing events at school to strike fear into the hearts of the American public to make people more amenable to manipulation to promote its political agenda, which is contrary to the best interests of the American people at the level of personal and family security, at the level of community and social security, and at the level of national security, which they obfuscate, misrepresent, fail to acknowledge in their zeal to preserve the viability of a Democratic Party tattered and torn by the falling apart of the Russian hacking revelations, the fact that the Mueller investigation is backfiring and showing that corruption came from the Department of Justice and the FBI, who are acting in collusion with the Democratic National Party and the Hillary Clinton campaign. I mean, it's embarrassingly bad. Now, in my opinion, what we're reading about here in the local papers, such as the Wisconsin State Journal, NRA pins blame on familiar list. From video games to mental health, here's what the gun lobby says leads to shooting. School buildings, Ritalin, video games, mental health, arming educators. And, you know, those we've heard before, but they aren't equal to the task, because what's really going on here is the subversion of the trust of the public in the mainstream media and even in the Democratic Party, which is manipulating, creating these events. After Barack Obama nullified the Smith-Mundt Act of 1948, which precluded the use of the same techniques of propaganda and disinformation within the United States as were being used without, by the National Defense Appropriation Act of 2013, in time to bring us Sandy Hook, subsequently a host of events, including prominently shootings, but also others such as the Boston bombing, Orlando and Dallas, Charlottesville, Las Vegas, Parkland, now even Santa Fe. As an expert in these areas who has developed a new specialization as a false flag analyst, I want you to know I bring together the best qualified individuals to study these cases. We do thorough research. We publish videos about them, write articles about them. I even am editing books about them. And the fact is, I want to contribute our expertise to understanding what's going on here, because it's not at all as it appears in the mainstream media, alas, which is overwhelmingly controlled by the U.S. intelligence agencies and the Ziocons, the combination of the Zionists and neocons, aren't playing straight with the American people. Let me explain. We begin with the amendment itself. A well-regulated militia being necessary to the security of a free state, the right of the people to keep and bear arms shall not be infringed. Sounds pretty straightforward, doesn't it? On the other hand, today we're getting publications, articles like this from Nation of Change, mass shootings, children being gunned down in cold blood, a dark stain on the soul of America. We Americans may not realize it, but we are being mentally conditioned by this government to accept these mass shootings as part of our culture embedded in our society. Except these mass shootings are being staged. I'm talking about Sandy Hook. I'm talking about Parkland. I'm talking about Santa Fe and a host of others. These are not bona fide legitimate events. Turning to the amendment itself, A well-regulated militia be necessary to the security of a free state. The right of the people to keep and bear arms shall not be infringed. Reflects the concept of citizen soldiers prepared to defend liberty, where that right has now been subjected to an unprecedented attack. I mean, where would we be were it not for citizen soldiers who had created this nation, establishing our emancipation from the United Kingdom by conducting unconventional warfare, which would have been impossible did we not have weapons at our disposal. A report about the Second Amendment on this particular topic, Wikipedia is okay, but it's a politically biased organization, and generally you cannot take for granted what it has to report to be accurate and true any more than you can the so-called fact checkers like PolitiFact and Snopes, which turn out to be ops for the intel agencies, a second layer of disinformation to confirm earlier or frontline layers of disinformation, which the American people have to understand. The Second Amendment to the Constitution protects the right of the people to keep and bear arms and was adopted on December 15, 1791, as part of the first 10 amendments contained in the Bill of Rights. The Supreme Court of the United States has ruled that the right belongs to individuals, while also acknowledging it's not unlimited, does not prohibit all regulation of either firearms or similar devices. State and local governments, however, are limited to the same extent as the federal government from infringing on this right as it is incorporated in the Bill of Rights, which is a very important point because we're going to find that there are local communities and states that are right now, based upon these fabricated shooting incidents, that are going ahead and constraining the right of their own citizens, of their communities, of their states, to keep and bear arms in violation of the Constitution. And while it may eventually be the case that these are brought before the Supreme Court for rulings, typically that takes years, an arduous legal process, expensive and time-consuming, where the damage can be done in the meanwhile before the lack of constitutionality has been determined, as, for example, has occurred in these efforts to dispute the president's right to restrict immigration from regions where terrorism is prevalent, where he, I think, inadvisedly restrained on the basis of religion when he meant region, because, of course, his efforts aren't, in fact, directed at Muslims worldwide. The vast majority of Muslims live in Southeast Asia, regions other than the Middle East, and there was no restriction upon immigration there. But the fact is that when the courts are not properly adjudicating the law, a lot of mischief can take place, in this instance by a lot of immigrants that continue to be brought into this country under programs of Barack Obama, who, by the way, seems to have had a whole lot to do with all of this, because, in fact, the abrogation of the Smith-Mundt Act, which precluded the use of the same techniques of disinformation and propaganda within the United States as without, was nullified by the National Defense Appropriation Act of 2013, which Obama approved in time to bring us Sandy Hook and a whole host of other fabricated events, the Boston bombing, Orlando, Dallas, and so forth, several of which I shall address here today. Interestingly, as Dr. Reelwan, who has a brilliant website, Fellowship of the Mind, has observed, during a radio interview with Hugh Hewitt back on 23 February, but of this year, now Stanford political science professor but former George W. Bush Secretary of State Condoleezza Rice said, "I think it's time to have a conversation about what the right to keep and bear arms means in the modern world. I don't understand why civilians need to have access to military weapons. We wouldn't say you can go out and buy a tank, Bear in mind, however, that this is the same woman who misled the American people about the weapons of mass destruction in the possession of Saddam Hussein in order to induce fear again into the public to support the political agenda of the Bush-Cheney administration, which wanted to invade Iraq, so that she even talked about, she wouldn't want, our next encounter with Saddam to entail a mushroom cloud, when there turned out to be no weapons of mass destruction, one more massive lie compounded by so many we've heard from the government. But what we're talking about here with regard to the Second Amendment is a bottom line issue. This makes a difference to the United States on multiple levels of security, personal and family security, social and community security, and national security, as I shall explain. Who really uses guns to commit violence? Notice here, District of Columbia versus Heller was the first Supreme Court case to decide whether the Second Amendment protects an individual's right to keep and bear arms for self-defense. Prior to the court's ruling, the Firearms Control Regulation Act of 1975 had restricted District of Columbia residents from owning handguns, except for those registered prior to 1975. But the court in District of Columbia versus Heller struck down the Regulation Act's ban on handguns as unconstitutional, as well as the Act's requirements that all firearms, including rifles and shotguns, be kept unloaded and disassembled or bound by a trigger lock. This is a very significant ruling vis-a-vis issues today. But notice, here we have government officers following popular orders, citizens who went along with gun control and were slaughtered by their own government. Indeed, a point to which I shall return, is that the University of Hawaii's Democide Project determined that there were 19 genocides during the 20th century, each of which was preceded by gun confiscation. The majority opinion, written by the late Justice Antonin Scalia, is considered an example of constitutional originalism, interpreting the meaning of the Constitution in accordance with the original intent of our founders. According to the court's ruling, the Second Amendment protects the individual's right to possess a firearm unconnected with service in a militia. The people to whom the Second Amendment right is accorded are the same people who enjoy First and Fourth Amendment protection. As Scalia wrote, the Constitution was written to be understood by the voters. Its words and phrases were used in their normal and ordinary meaning. Where the court's interpretation is confirmed by analogous arms-bearing rights in state constitution that preceded and immediately followed the Second Amendment, the interpretation of the Second Amendment by scholars, courts, and legislators from immediately after its ratification through the late 19th century, where we know the right is not unlimited, but it's a fundamental right, and where the local and state authorities cannot go beyond the constitutional requirements. Deerfield, Illinois is a perfect example of a community that's gone whole hog. Residents have been given 60 days to surrender their assault weapons. Otherwise, they'll be subjected to fines of up to $1,000 a day. Based upon the Parkland, Texas, Las Vegas, and Orlando shootings, ignorant of the fact that these were all politically staged events. I mean, this is an astounding development here, where Parkland, Illinois has gone overboard in ignorance, it appears, not only of the law, but of the facts of the matter. Residents of Deerfield, Illinois have 60 days to turn in their assault weapons or face fines up to $1,000 a day. Earlier in the week, the Village Board of Trustees passed an ordinance which banned certain types of assault weapons and large capacity magazines, including the Ruger 1022, which can accept magazines that hold more than 10 rounds. Semi-automatic pistols that can hold more than 10 rounds have also been banned. Law enforcement and retired law enforcement members of the community are exempted from the ban. Residents will have to either sell their weapons, transfer ownership, to someone living outside of town, turn them into police, or pay the exorbitant fines, which range from $250 to $1,000 a day. The deadline is June 13th, forthcoming. Authorities justified the ban by pointing to the recent spate of mass shootings, including last year's Sutherland Springs shooting, which was stopped by a man using one of the very guns Deerfield is now banned. How's that for an irony? Was, according to them, it was held constitutional by the Seventh Circuit in similar laws in California, the District in Columbia, and Maryland, but their constitutionality has not been assessed by the Supreme Court. And these, therefore, appear to be cases where communities and states are actually passing laws that will not survive the test of constitutionality. In the ordinance, the definition of an assault weapon includes, among others, semi-automatic rifles with fixed magazines with capacity to accept more than 10 rounds, shotguns with revolving cylinders, semi-auto pistols, and rifles that can accept large capacity magazines. Among the dozens of specific models cited are the AR-15, AK-47, and Uzi, according to the ordinance. The rationale, and this is absolutely crucial, mentions 4 recent shooting incidents that have claimed a total of 150 lives. The shootings at Marjorie Stoneman Douglas High School that left 17 dead. A massacre at the First Baptist Church in Sutherland Springs, Texas that killed 26 people. The Las Vegas Music Festival shooting that left 58 dead. And the Pulse nightclub mass shooting in Orlando, Florida that killed 49 people. But I guarantee you, each one of these was a stage event. None of them was bona fide, none of them was authentic, and nobody died. So as I have written, the Board of Trustees of Deerfield, Illinois, in open letter, you have both the law and the facts wrong here. You, dear Village Board of Trustees, you and your legal counselor, Matthew Rose of Rosenthal, Murphy, Koblenz, and Donahue appear to have both your facts and the law wrong. Whereas I understand the requirements of legal advisors, they are obligated to ensure that the advice they provide to their clients is consistent with truth, and that they shall not seek to mislead by an artifice or false statement of fact or law. That has not happened in this case. The rationale for passing this extraordinary and to me on its face blatantly unconstitutional constraint upon the Second Amendment are 4 reported shooting incidents that have claimed 150 lives. The shooting in Parkland, Florida, which left 17 dead. The Sutherland Springs, Texas shooting, which took 26 lives. The Las Vegas shooting, another 58. And the Orlando shooting that killed 49 others. 50 when you include the purported shooter. But you have not verified the facts. There are many reasons why I committed a blunder in moving to take guns away from law-abiding citizens. They are not the problem. And how will your community defend itself if riots break out in Chicago and spill over into your community? Or if a motorcycle gang came to town and began looting your stores and raping your women? European nations overrun with immigrants wish they had a Second Amendment so they could defend themselves against assaults. Mike is that appropriate actions can only take place when they are based upon true beliefs. William Casey, whom Ronald Reagan appointed as director of the CIA, told his staff at their first meeting, our disinformation campaign will be a success when everything the American people believe is false. Since Barack Obama nullified the Smith-Mundt Act of 1948, precluding the use of propaganda and disinformation within the United States, coming closer and closer to realizing Casey's goal. If you review the research to which I am linking, you will rapidly discover you have acted on the basis of false beliefs, which is hardly surprising since the mainstream media has been reinforcing the political agenda of the deep state, which wants to deprive us of our rights under the First and Second Amendments. If once you learn the facts about these cases, you continue to want to deprive them of their right to keep and bear arms, so be it. That is your decision. But you should not be acting on the basis of beliefs that are false. They don't have their facts right. The permit for the pulse, for example, had expired 3 years earlier. The Parkland shooting was staged using simulated ammo, known as simunition. The Las Vegas event with special visual effects. The Texas shooting was one more shooting. And I want you to understand, I am a professional scholar, 35 years as an academician, having published 24 scholarly works, hundreds of scholarly articles, where since my retirement after a 35-year career as a professor of philosophy, offering primarily courses in logic, critical thinking, and scientific reasoning, I have been alarmed, even dumbfounded, by the extent to which the mainstream media has been playing the American people for saps with these staged events, beginning with Sandy Hook, where I brought together experts, 13 experts, and published a book about Sandy Hook that Amazon promptly banned. The 13 included 6 current or retired Ph.D. professors. We established the school had been closed by 2008, and there were no students there. We even found the FEMA manual for a 2-day exercise with a rehearsal on the 13th going live on the 14th in order to, create then presented as a false impression that it had been a real event where some of the participants became confused about the date, where many have put up donation websites a day before the shooting, where even Adam Lanza, the purported shooter, had his death initially recorded in the Social Security Death Index as having happened on the 13th, making his feat in shooting 20 children and 6 adults the following day all the more remarkable. Well, here's the Orlando Club. In fact, notice it only had 11 parking spaces. It had a legal occupancy of 150. The permit for the club had expired 3 years earlier. I have a book about this, From Orlando to Dallas and Beyond, where if you want to go into depth, you're welcome to do that. It's available at moonrockbooks.com, as are others I will cite. But the fact of the matter is, this was a completely staged event. The club wasn't even open. They maintained that it was packed with over 300. Oh, well, since it only had a legal occupancy of 150, it would have been massively crowded wall to wall, but that wasn't the case. And you would have had, since there are only 11 parking spaces, there would have been abandoned cars all over the place, but they weren't there. In fact, we had some very incompetent actors, crisis actors they're called, because they're acting in relation to what is supposed to be a crisis. They were extremely bad crisis actors, carrying one another even toward the club rather than away. There was no surge of ambulances here to rush bodies off to the Orlando emergency medical facility, which actually subsequently declared it wasn't charging for services rendered for the good reason that it didn't render any services. I have a correspondent in the area wrote to tell me it wasn't even a gay club. I mean, how bad is that? This is a couple of frames from a video at the Parkland shooting. Now, there was supposed to be 3,500 students there. I was puzzled, therefore, that we didn't have hundreds of videos, because virtually every one of those 3,500 students would have had their own cell phone, which have a camera and video capability. But we don't find them. What we have is one video from Live Leaks, 52 seconds long. In this video, you can see students doing their best imitation of crime while being concerned about their bottled water. It turns out bottled water is ubiquitous at these events. Another on her iPod, a kid pulling his putts. You look over the floor and you see what initially looks to be a body, but when you look closer, It's a dummy. It's a training dummy. It has no arms and no head, and it's lying on a pool of fake blood. That was a technique they also used in Boston, where they actually recruited amputee actors. So when you peered through the smoke after these very feeble explosives, you saw bodies lying there without arms and legs, but there was no blood. As Lorraine Day, MD, in charge of trauma surgery for San Francisco General Hospital for 35 years, has observed, that is a physiological impossibility. You can't have bodies missing arms and legs blown off by explosives and there be no blood. The blood only showed up later, and it came out of little orange duffel bags, of which 5 or 6 of these fake blood kits were lying around when they cleared the area. Also in this 52-second video from Parkland, you see what appear to be police officers running in and out, but they're actors too, because Parkland gave up its police force in 2004. Parkland doesn't have any cops. I think those who staged this were ignorant of the fact, and they put in Parkland shooters. Indeed, it turns out the reason why Sheriff Israel, who was clearly the local, arrangements chairman for this contrived event on behalf of the DNC, didn't allow 4 deputies to enter the building, is they weren't part of the loop. He was worried they might shoot one of those who were engaged in this contrived event, and and blow the whole thing. So he ordered them not to enter. Sane progressivists have sorted out what happened here. It turns out that because it was Valentine's Day, February 14th, they let the students go at 1 p.m. Then they conducted the drill late in the afternoon with only a handful. She's gone through the videos again and again and again. She finds maybe 48, maybe 60 students max who are participants in this elaborate charade. The vast majority had already gone home. They'd been sent home at 1 o'clock. I mean, I'm telling you, it's that bad. This is from Las Vegas. Two really good students with whom I've done research on Las Vegas are Moda Alexis Presley, who's been following up on the obituaries for the victims whose photographs and biosketches were published, for example, in USA Today. And she's found that to the extent to which they're not simply Photoshopped variations on one another, that they were based on people who died in different states or on different dates or from different causes of death. Another, Dan Cromer, who's an IT guy, discovered that the soundtrack, the recordings of audio from Las Vegas were too high quality to have been authentic recorded at the scene. What they did was use a pre-recorded soundtrack. They played over the PA system. Some experts, such as Mike Adams, has analyzed the content of the soundtrack and discovered the shots fired from multiple directions. But the fact is he's basing it on what he is presuming to be an authentic, was actually a prefabricated, a pre-recorded soundtrack, where they had coordinated special visual effects. On the 4th floor of the Mandalay Bay, you see lights flashing to simulate a machine gun. Higher up, you find 3 light bursts to simulate modern American military weapons. We even have a video where there's a guy in the crowd who turns to fire on the crowd, and you can see light flashing from his weapon, an AR-15. But there's no impact of any shots because he was firing blanks. Anastasia Smith has gone through 33 videos and found lots of sounds of shots, but no one being shot. We even have a new video that's turned up where you have a crisis director actually getting out in front of the camera to tell her crisis actors they got to redo their scene, okay? What you're looking at here now is the Las Vegas Metropolitan Police Department crime map for the square mile area surrounding the concert, where you can see from 8 p.m. on the 1st to 8 p.m. on the 2nd, in other words, overlapping the area during which this event was alleged to be taking place. Here are the actual crimes reported by the Las Vegas Metropolitan Police themselves. other disturbance, assault and battery, other disturbance, assault and battery, burglary, stolen motor vehicle, burglary, malicious destruction, other disturbance, recovered motor vehicle, other disturbance, robbery, not a single gunshot victim there. Because there was no real bona fide shooting. In fact, a Facebook friend very intelligently contacted the 3 hospitals closest to the concert area and asked them whether they had had any gunshot victim admittees. And all 3 of them admitted no, they hadn't had a single gunshot victim. One of them cheerfully adding, I think you're calling about the drill the other day, but no one was shot. You ought to check with the local police. I have a huge amount of this, including videos about Las Vegas I've done with Kerry Cassidy, about Parkland I've done with Kerry Cassidy, others about Parkland I've done, but you're not going to find them on YouTube because YouTube is taking them down as fast as they can. They're striking people. My Sandy Hook videos have been massively struck. Mike Adams, ranked number 2 most influential on the internet, for example, discovered that an interview he did with me back in 2015 when the book Nobody Died at Sandy Hook was banned by Amazon.com had been struck, and they took down his whole channel. He had over 1,700 videos and 200,000 followers. It was all taken down. He's had it restored now. He's back up, but he has been so astonished that reviewing the bidding he's found, they're taking down interviews with me that have been done across the board. There are multiple cases taking place, including even Richie Allen, who has one of the most famous talk shows in the world out of the UK across the continent. Or Richie did an interview with me about Parkland, and YouTube took down his YouTube channel as a consequence. So interestingly, you can go to Natural News and look for an article entitled Most Dangerous Mind in America interviewed about false flags and extreme censorship, where he published an interview he'd done with me about 8 weeks ago. Actually, after 6 weeks had passed, I thought he'd never, wasn't actually going to use it. But where at the end of the interview, he explained why he thought that I was deserving of that title, because what I'm doing here is so threatening to the deep state. And I've got to tell you, I'm finding my own blog now is being interfered with massively. A representative is coming into the blog. This, I believe, to be a fellow who calls himself Lenny Posner. He's supposed to be the father of Noah. Well, Noah was a most unusual little boy from Sandy Hook because he not only died reportedly on 14 December 2012, but again in Pakistan on 16 December 2014. Lenny sent Kelly Watt, with whom he had 100 hours of conversation where Kelly explained she didn't believe a word he said. She didn't believe he had a son, didn't believe he died. A death certificate that turned out to be a fabrication. It was the bottom half of a real death certificate, the top half of a fake. It had no file number. It had the wrong estimated time of death at 11 a.m. when the shooting officially took place between 9:35 and 9:40. Well, we've done additional research. It turns out not only was Noah Posner, as Kelly Watt had surmised and as we confirmed, based upon photographs of who was supposed to be his older stepbrother, Michael Vabner, but we've even found out that Lenny Posner himself appears to be Reuben Vabner, who is Michael Vabner's father, which explains why Lenny Posner won't allow even his face to be seen on interviews. A program was done on Showtime it's called The Dark Net, where they feature a positive use of the internet, a negative, but one in between, a controversial I did on Sandy Hook with me and Lenny Posner. And as even my family, who are not wild about my research in all of these issues. But you could see, every mole on my face. I mean, it was probably the best defined image of my face ever broadcast on television. But Lenny refused to allow his face to be seen and remained in the shadows. Very peculiar indeed, aesthetically, thematically. Here's a guy who claims to be attacking those who are distorting the truth about Sandy Hook and won't even allow his face to be seen. Well, blogs about this and about the New York Times attacking Sandy Hook truthers are being taken down from my blog again and again and again. If you want, I'm doing my best to restore them, but I'm telling you, this is confirmation that we're onto it, that we know what's going on, that these indeed are staged, just as we've said, and the deeper we dig, the more they're resisting. They're panic-stricken that the public is going to understand that these are contrived events, and therefore communities like Deerfield, Illinois, and the states like California and Maryland won't be motivated to pass restrictive gun laws in violation of the Constitution if they understand that the reasons for doing that are staged events. This is from that church shooting in Texas. Once again, it was another quite ridiculous case. I did a fair amount about it at the time. The inside of the church and the services were very peculiar. It was like a rock band. They had one guy with a double neck guitar, another acoustical guitars, totally out of the mainstream, very peculiar. But the fact is, it was supposed to be a swath of blood inside the church. And here you see crime scene investigators. Look at their boots. There's not a speck of blood there. That's because it was another staged event. And they're doing this in different ways to target different populations. You're supposed to think schools are unsafe, so we need to take extreme measures to protect them. One of the rationales, resorts and casinos, even as in Las Vegas, churches. Among the revelations we have about Las Vegas, by the way, is that the CEO of Mandalay Bay sold off 80% of his stock in advance of the event to buy it up on the cheap when the stock fell. George Soros put a $41 million short on Las Vegas in order to make a bundle when the stock fell. A fellow who identified himself as John wrote on 4chan in advance that part of the agenda was for the Chertoff group, which is headed by Michael Chertoff, who was our second head of Homeland Security, who installed all of those body scanners in airports that we have to deal with, where I refused to do it. So they put me through a humiliating pat down as a consequence. Had the plan that they wanted to install their scanners in all the resorts and casinos in Las Vegas, and eventually extend them to churches and schools all over the country and make hundreds of billions of dollars. Let me just make one observation about this fantastic scheme. And again, it's all predicated, you see, on fabricating a problem, a non-existent problem as though it were real, and then offering a highly expensive solution to make those involved in aiding and abetting us in solving our problem a bundle. Just think about it. One of the journalists who was supporting this idea said it only slows down your entrance to an entertainment venue by 30 seconds. But I thought about it. I mean, you go to the dentist and they're going to do an x-ray. They cover you with a lead vest before the exposure of your teeth to a millisecond of radiation. Who knows how much damage can be done to the human body by 30 seconds of radiation exposure, where the safety of these devices has never been subjected to a check. And of course, the Chertoff group couldn't care less. They just want to make their billions. And believe me, I mean, that's a powerful motive at work here as well. If you want to see a very thorough going about Sandy Hook, see, I can't have it on YouTube. I put this up on BitChute. This is very thorough. It takes an hour and a half. Going through Sandy Hook, shows the deplorable condition of the schools, shows all the measures they took, how the whole thing was faked and fabricated. You can see where we created a GIF, where you can see Noah Posner turned into Michael Wagner. And it has been a discovery even since I made that video, which was first published on the 14th of January, that we've been able to establish that Lenny Posner actually is Reuben Wagner, Michael Wagner's father, which makes perfect sense because we have all these photographs of the person who was supposed to be Noah Posner with a man who's supposed to be Lenny. Once we establish that Noah is actually Michael Wagner, it shouldn't come as a surprise that it turns out that Lenny is Reuben Wagner. You know, the fakery here is astonishing, and frankly, I believe that Lenny has perpetrated a fraud upon the court because he's brought legal issues based upon a fake identity, not to mention false claims about the death of a non-existent son who was a fiction made up out of photographs of Michael Wagner when he was younger. Here's another now, and I highly recommend this. This is a player at Boston, a crisis actor. He's identified as Jeff Bauman there. One of the most interesting aspects of this Boston thing is that if you peer in through the smoke, you see there's this guy who seems to have lost his legs, where there's someone in a hoodie who's attaching a false bone prosthesis to the end of his leg. You can actually see it extending there in the upper left-hand corner, okay? This fellow is supposed to be Jeff Bauman. Well, we've identified himself. He's actually Nick Voigt, a former U.S. Army officer who lost his legs in Kandahar, Afghanistan with the 1st Stryker Brigade. He also lost the little finger on his left hand. Okay, that becomes very interesting given what I'm about to explain. Now, if you have your legs blown off, as in this case, from the bleed out, you're going to be unconscious in 1 minute, dead in 2. The last thing you want to do with a victim of this kind is to put him in a wheelchair, because then gravity will help the blood flow. And yet that's what they did here. He lay on the ground for far in excess, probably around 5 minutes, before the fellow in the cowboy hat, who turns out to be named Carlos Arredondo, helps to lift him and put him in a wheelchair, and they rush him off. Now, it turns out the vibrations from the wheelchair were so substantial that they caused the false bone prosthesis to come loose, and they had to stop and reattach it. It's that bad. Now, I only know the identity of Carlos because a Hollywood producer-director by the name of Nathan Folks identified him as an actor he'd cast in one of his own films, and also mentioned to me that they'd even used a smoke machine. I found that dumbfounding, so we went back and studied all the footage and videos, and we found a studio quality smoke machine they'd used at Boston, which I put a photo of it on the back cover of the book, and nobody died in Boston either. There were a couple casualties, but not from the marathon bombing. That was a completely staged event. But the point I want to lead to here regarding Jeff Bauman, within 19 days, you have supposed to be the same person, Jeff Bauman, at a Boston Bruins game. He's looking real fit. Now, originally, his legs appear to be blown off below the knee. Now his legs are blown off above the knee, but he's looking real cheerful, waving a Boston Bruins flag, and he's got his little digit. In other words, this is a second crisis actor they used in Boston. Believe it or not, Gary King, with whom I do a weekly show about the latest research on JFK, with Don Fox and Larry Rivera, found a third example where Jeff Bauman is wheeled out by none other than Carlos Arredondo during a baseball game, and now he doesn't have any legs at all. I mean, I'm telling you, it's that bad. So Gary and I did a show called Boston Strong, the 3 Jeff Baumans, because they have 3 different actors, it appears, playing Jeff Bauman. I mean, how bad is that? This is how blatantly we're being played. In this particular How to Spot a False Flag, and it's up a couple of places, I think 153news.net, maybe also on DTube. These are the places you have to go other than YouTube to find it. It might be on Vimeo. I go through about 15 different cases. I go through 15 different cases in short segments. Each runs about max of 10 minutes and shows you how we can tell this is a phony stage contrived event. I do it about 15 times, okay? Even including JFK and 9/11. So if you want to, get an introduction, because it turns out the American people are being played for saps, you got to guard yourself, you got to become educated, you got to understand how these things are done. So I highly recommend How to Spot a False Flag to broaden your background so you won't be played. And as I mentioned before, I have books about, most of these, in fact, right now we're copy editing a book about Parkland. So that should be out in a couple of weeks. I leapfrogged over Las Vegas because there's still developments in Las Vegas. Well, one of the oddities was, as I say, since no one died in Las Vegas, and Crowds on Demand was recruiting crisis actors 15 days in advance of Las Vegas. The coroner didn't have any death certificates or autopsy reports when the event took place, so he simply closed his office. Well, that led to a Freedom of Information Act request and a directive from the judge that he had to release them. So he balked and balked and balked, and what he ultimately did, I mean, this is just stunning, was to secure 58 autopsy reports from 6 different coroners all over the country. One, I think, is even abroad, struck the names, struck out the file numbers, and presented them as though they were victims of Las Vegas. I mean, I'm telling you, it's bad enough. Gag me with a spoon. The corruption is simply overwhelming. So I've been waiting for this to settle down about the whole autopsy bit, because the judge ought to be incensed, and we'll see whether he turns out to take any further action at this blatant deception of the court and the public. So here you'll see, including, I might mention that second from the left at the top, the New Gutenberg Press. This is a book by Preston James, Ph.D., a social psychologist, who is addressing why the internet has become such a threat to the deep state, because it has so encouraged and facilitated research among disparate investigators. I mean, it took us, let's call it 50 years to sort out JFK. And this, you see on the top right, that's my 4th book on JFK, 2017, where in all of these books I bring together the best experts. There are 15 contributors to that book about how we've been able to prove, for example, that Lee Oswald was actually standing in the doorway of the book depository when the motorcade passed by, which is the deepest secret the Warren Commission sought to cover up. But in the New Gutenberg Press, Preston James lays out why the deep state is so threatened by the internet and why they're trying to crack down now, taking such desperate measures, and Mike Adams were practicing such extreme censorship. Okay, you can check this out at your leisure. I give you sketches of each book, a list of all the contributors. There are 12 to 15 contributors in each of the books, apart from the single-authored book, of which there are 3. The JFK Horseman, top left, by Larry Rivera. Chronicles of False Flag Terror, second from the right, where Nick Kollerstrom, who's the leading expert in the world on the London 7/7 subway bombing, where his book Terror on the Tube is now in its 3rd edition, where he cracked the case by discovering that the train from Luton, which the young Muslim lads had apparently been lured into participating in a drill, where the explosions took place at the same tube stops at the same time that the drill had specified, where they use these drills as cover, had been canceled that day, so they weren't even on location. They went to Canary Wharf when they figured out what was going on to try to reach the international press to tell them how they'd been set up, and the bobbies shot them down. Dead men tell no tale. And then White Rose Blooms in Wisconsin, lower right, that's Mike Palachuk, who wrote a book about the efforts of Kevin Barrett and myself to bring the truth to the American people, where we had a show together called the Dynamic Duo for a year and a half, where I founded Scholars for 9/11 Truth and a host of other issues. So Mike actually wrote about it. All the others I edited and have, as I say, 12 of 15 contributors. And the beat goes on in Santa Fe, Texas. Too many tweets were showing up too early to be authentic. The trench coat turns out to be fabricated with Nazi and Antifa insignia. As in Las Vegas, a crisis act director was again caught in the act. They won't let the media talk to the kids about what happened. These are all very telling signs. We get these somber reports from the New York Times. Texas school shooting, 10 dead, 10 hurt. Many not surprised it happened. A nation plagued by a nightmarish loop of mass school shootings. And you're telling me the New York Times hasn't figured this out? When I and my colleagues are out there talking about it, giving talks, publishing articles, even publishing books. Can the New York Times be so ignorant and oblivious that it doesn't know that there's a massive research that shows these are fake? Don't kid yourself. The New York Times is the deep state. The only news that's fit to print is that fits a political agenda. It's a disgrace. The latest to play out in a small East Texas town Friday is a young man armed with a shotgun and a .38 revolver smuggled under his coat, opened fire on a high school campus, killing 10 people, many of them his fellow students, wounding 10 more, the authorities said. Well, you don't see anything in that photograph, do you, that suggests something serious was going on? They did up their game at Sandy Hook. Not only was there no surge of EMTs into the building, no string of ambulances to rush the little bodies off to hospitals where they could be declared to be dead or alive, but not even the medevac helicopters were called. Wolfgang Halbig actually talked with a company, and they were just dumbfounded that they weren't called to bring a medevac helicopter in, which, as Wolf observed, they even do for drills. Well, in Texas, they brought in a couple of medevac helicopters. They had some ambulances, but there weren't any bodies to be seen. You know, at Parkland, you had somebody who was put on a stretcher and put into an ambulance, but as Sane Progressive observed, he's smiling because, you know, he knows. Jim Stone was right on top of this. He discovered there were trolls on all the forums, even the non-major forums, all the forums, saying they had been there, they'd witnessed it, which proves they were set and staged to take action the moment it was published. So it either never happened or it was government sponsored. I mean, this is just ridiculous what's going on here. Jim Stone also discovered the website for the student, who's apparently, Greek Orthodox. He went to church. Some reports even sang in the choir. He played football. This is not a guy who's a killer. That he had this trench coat. Notice it's loaded with a Nazi, an Iron Star. This little red star on the lapel there, that's for Antifa, which is supposed to be an anti-Nazi organization, but actually is a Nazi organization. George Soros brought in these Antifa people to Charlottesville so they could they could channel the peaceful protesters. After the Charlottesville police were ordered to stand down, the governor, Terry McAuliffe, used the state police and the National Guard to channel him into a violent confrontation with the Antifa Black Lives Matter people. These are thugs. These are people who suppress speech. They use violence. They destroy buildings. They're anti-free speech. These are neo-Nazis, these Antifa people. But notice about the shirt. Notice the tag there. I mean, that's pristine. This appears to be a brand new trench coat that was just rigged for the occasion. Here we actually caught one of the crisis directors at work. Here she is, this woman, I don't know, late 40s, maybe early 50s, short hair, directing the students. Do any of the students look like a sense of urgency, like they're panic-stricken? No. And here you have her, directing in a bus. You got a couple, look what they're clutching in their hands, bottled water. At Sandy Hook, at the firehouse, there were boxes of bottled water and pizza. There were porta potties already in place. There were, people there with name tags on lanyards. There were parents bringing children to the scene. No parent is going to bring their child to the scene of a child shooting massacre. That's absurd. It turns out there was even a sign that says everyone must check in. Well, once you understand it was a FEMA drill, all the pieces fall into place. It says right in the manual, which I included as Appendix A in the book, which you can download for free for yourself by just entering the title, Nobody Died at Sandy Hook, says everyone must check in. Indeed, Wolfgang Halbig got Patricia LaLorda, the first selectman of Newtown, equivalent to the mayor, to acknowledge under oath that the sign had been placed there by Homeland Security, which, if the official story were true, wasn't even anywhere near Newtown or Sandy Hook. That's quite a concession. And of course, you see, for FEMA drills, they have refreshments and restrooms. So you had the porta potties, you had the pizza, and they identify the players by color-coded name tags on lanyards. Once you understand how the pieces fit together. Here is actually that video I mentioned previously from Las Vegas where the crisis director, a woman, got out in front of the camera and has the crisis actors redo their scene. She wasn't very happy about being caught on camera. She said, "Don't record that." Footage emerges of Vegas crisis director caught directing scene at Vegas shooting. You can find it. Now, I explained that at in Parkland, they appear to have let the students go early. Well, here they seem to have opened school early. In other words, at first period normally I'll start at 7:55. It appears they opened at 7:10 so they could fake conduct their little mini drill before school actually even began. Here is this wonderful woman who calls herself Sane Progressive, talking about what she has discovered at Parkland. Catch this.
You go look and you go watch the footage of what they showed you happen. Because if you go to the WPLG Local 10 news clip, they have 4 hours, near 4 hours of raw footage from the drone helicopter. It does not show a single person who had a gunshot wound being carried out. It does show empty gurneys being loaded in as rescues. It does show individuals who have absolutely no sign of injury with any medical equipment whatsoever. It shows that. It shows police officers riding around on golf carts with duffel bags the right size for carrying rescue dummies. Then it does show that. It doesn't show 3,500 students. There's probably only about 3 to 4 dozen students that were shown during the rescue at a school with 3,500 people. This is an empty stretcher that they've just put under a tent. He's smiling. He's smiling. I've watched the entire 4 hours of this video over a period of days. The news media has reported to you that there are 3,500 students that attend this high school. I have not seen more than 60 students in the entire 3 hours and 50 minutes of footage. I don't know where all those kids are.
Turns out, because it was a holiday, February 14th, early release day. Students dismissed at 1 p.m. through many counties in Florida, and it appears to be exactly what happened here in Broward at Parkland. I mean, it all fits. So I have a piece out there, I have a video entitled "The Parkland Puzzle: How the Pieces Fit Together." You can find it on DTube, for example. And it goes through the whole story about Parkland. This is what happened, how it was done. She's super. Now here we get a report from a research colleague about Santa Fe. I'm sure you're suspecting by now this is another deep state operation, and it has all the qualities of it. This is in my neck of the wood down here in Houston. There was a beta test back in February. Someone called 911 and said shots had been fired at the school. Then the lawyers for the so-called gunman said, "We didn't see this coming." Oh, really? Then what was that about back in February? Here's a link to that story. And how convenient that this happens during the NBA Finals. And the Houston Rockets happen to be playing, and a big deal made about it before the game with the Golden State Warriors the other night, with a huge audience. I am also highly suspect of this Pakistani exchange student story. Just too convenient that a Middle Eastern kid gets killed going to high school in Santa Fe, Texas. Here, and these points I think are even more telling. I cannot find a trace of either of these teachers they say were killed. And the story about them keeps changing, and even one of the names was changed. And they weren't even teachers. One's a teacher's age, the other's a substitute, according to the press reports. Neither has any teaching credentials with the state of Texas. Teacher aides are supposed to have a certificate, and even that has changed. They said Tinsdale was the aide, then they said she was the sub. They can't get their numbers or their names straight. Neither is listed as a staff member for the school. I mean, think about it. As the story was unfolding last Friday morning, some of the employees said they were told not to talk to the press, and the students were told the same thing, so they were putting them on buses and taking them to other schools. The local Houston reporters were trying to find out where they were being taken, and no one would even talk to them. How else could a parent know where to pick up their kid except from the press? Many had cell phones, but not all. A lot of the people being interviewed appear to me to be crisis actors. And we have more medical miracles in Parkland. We had a Maddie Wilford who was supposed to have been shot in the stomach and in the chest. The doctor said these were serious wounds with large caliber bullets. But that's absurd because this is supposed to be done with an an AR-15, which fires a .223 round, which is slightly larger than a .22, small caliber. Moreover, you could not be shot in the stomach or in the chest and survive if you're shot with an AR-15. But he explained it all away. He said, young people heal fast. I mean, this is stupid. This is so insulting. We had a mother from Parkland, Samantha Fuentes, who was shot in both legs. And yet a week later, she's walking along with Band-Aids on her wound. The New York Times even itself published a video about the traumatic effects of AR-15 wounds to the legs. You couldn't possibly cover them up with Band-Aids. So here we have another miracle shooting in Santa Fe, Texas. Star High School baseball player survives gunshot to the head. Bullet pierced Rome Schubert's head at Santa Fe High School Friday morning. By afternoon, he was home. Right, shot in the head and you're home by afternoon. I mean, look, who believes this kind of bullshit? I got to tell you, it's outrageous. It's outrageous. And that's what we're being sold on the left and right. The mainstream media is right in their pitching and promoting this utter rubbish. Utter rubbish. Medical miracles. Gun bans, it turned out, lead to increases in homicide. Crime rates tend to rise when popular activities are criminalized. It happened with prohibition. It continues with the war on drugs. Gun homicides and violence have steadily dropped here in the USA since 1993. Nations with the highest gun ownership turn out to have the lowest homicide rates. Here's a very interesting chart that shows how crime homicides increased with the beginning of prohibition, dropped after prohibition, increased with the war on drugs, but it's been dropping steadily, as we're about to see. So why are guns now supposed to be a problem? Here are a couple of very illustrative, very instructive graphs. How gun violence has declined since the 1990s. Deaths by firearms per 100,000 people. Total, 15.2 in 1993, down to 10.5. And that's a 33% drop, a one-third drop by 2014. Notice suicides remain relatively constant, which are, of course, deaths by gun. 7.3, 6.7, not much change there. But homicides have dropped by more than a half, from 7.0 in 93 to 3.4 in 2014. Total gun violence, non-fatal firearms crime dropped dramatically, 75%. Look, 1993, 725.3 per 100,000. By 2014, dropped to 174.8. So what's supposed to be the problem? Not only that, but what we're being told is such poppycock. The liberal left, and look, I used to be among them. I voted twice for Bill Clinton. I voted twice for Barack Obama. And in retrospect, the problem was their opponents were not worthy opponents. You know, I mean, I can't really gainsay my votes in those occasions. I vote for the better candidate, just as I voted for Donald Trump over Hillary Clinton, who's brought more death, destruction, mayhem to the world than, any other recent presidential candidate. If you set aside Henry Kissinger, who's been an advisor to so many, Hillary, for her slaughter of Libya, deserves special identification and responsibility. Grotesque. But look here. You find that the nations with the highest gun ownership have the lowest homicide rate. Look at the top. Firearms per 100 people. North America, the United States, Canada, very high. Look at the bottom map. Homicides per 100,000, very, very low. Look at Latin South America, Brazil, for example, very low gun ownership, very high homicide rate. Look at Africa, very low gun ownership, very high homicide rate. Look at Russia, very low gun ownership, very high homicide rate. So we appear to confront the alternative that we can have high gun ownership and low homicide rates, or low gun ownership and high homicide rates. And, actually, the U.S. homicide rate in the world is relatively low. We're ranked about number 100 for homicides. So what's going on here is a political scam. The DNC is trying to make headway. They're worried about the midterm election. They're actually staging these phony events. And I lay it out very specifically. Parkland was produced by Debbie Wasserman Schultz, directed by Dina Katz, a Hollywood producer who is responsible for Dancing with the Stars. She actually got the permit. She had to begin the permit process 180 days in advance because that's what the Mayor's Special Task Force requires for events that were, involve closing the streets. We have documented this in spades. I mean, the fraud is immense. But the bottom line is that the basic contention they would have you believe that higher gun ownerships means higher gun homicide is completely false. Gun bans threaten security at 3 levels: personal and family security. Cops can take as long as 20 minutes to show up at your door. If you're worried what's going to happen, you call the police because you're not armed. Since most takes place in the first 5 to 6 minutes, by the time they show up at your door, your daughter may have been raped, your wife may have been mugged, she may have been killed, you may have been mugged. I mean, so personal and family security matters. Community and social. Take this community of Deerfield, Illinois. When riots spill out over, out of Chicago into Deerfield, they won't be able to protect themselves. Or if a motorcycle gang came to town. Contrast that with Northfield, Minnesota, where the citizens, when they realized Jesse James and his gang were coming to town, got their own weapons and took them out. That's a community standing up for itself. But if the gun grabbers have their way, it would have been impossible to do. None of us could defend ourselves. National security. Emperor Hirohito wanted to invade the United States, but his highest-ranking military experts advised him that would be the wrong thing to do because there'd be a sniper behind every bush. Well, if the gun grabbers had their way, then today we'd all be speaking Japanese. I mean, it's idiotic. China has the world's largest standing army, but we have far more. China has a standing army of 2.5 million, but we in the United States have an informal army of over 100 million. This is our greatest source of security and why they're unlikely to want to take on the United States of America unless, of course, the gun grabbers have their way, in which case all bets are off. The Founding Fathers knew what they were doing. They have done it well, and we ought to recognize their wisdom and support the Second Amendment. We know gun bans lead to increases in homicides, where the UK banned guns and the UK homicide rate went up. It's now experiencing a skyrocketing increase in knife attacks. So the London mayor wants to ban all of those killer knives. What will they ban yet? Potato peelers, screwdrivers? So, the UK disarmed its citizen. Murders are skyrocketing. There are many ways to kill people besides with guns. There was a time when the then Prime Minister, Robert Gascoigne Cecil, the Marquis of Salisbury, said he would laud the day when there was a rifle in every cottage in England. Well, those times are long past. Scotland Yard has called an emergency meeting as London is now gripped by unprecedented violent crime. This spike comes as an ex-senior official says, police have lost control of the streets, following a massive spike in murders, one that's now surpassed that of New York City. Police chiefs are scrambling to try and tackle knife and gun violence in the city. I mean, it's just astonishing what's going on. The problem's gotten worse, so that 6 teenagers were stabbed this week in the space of only 90 minutes. The need for the police would be drastically diminished if the citizens of London could simply defend themselves. However, that's not an option unless they use sticks or knives under 3 inches. A futile choice considering the fact that the criminals have illegal guns and knives at their disposal. As even many police chiefs in the U.S. understand, the police can't be everywhere to stop every crime. Police chiefs across the country have urged that citizens arm themselves because a well-armed citizen is the best defense against crime, not the police. The London mayor, Sadiq Khan, has enacted a knife control policy to crack down on the stabbing epidemics. The Blaze reported last week the number of murders in London, a traditionally safe city, has surpassed the number of murders in New York City in February and March for the first time in modern history, mostly carried out in stabbing attacks. But now they're worried about other weapons, pliers, scissors, screwdrivers. In fact, my anticipation that they'd go to the extreme has come true, because they're even now banning potato peelers. They're even using acid for attacks. The United Kingdom, access by the general public to firearms being tightly controlled. Members of the public can own sporting rifles and shotguns subject to license, but handguns were banned after the Dunblane school massacre in 1996, which I have reason to believe was also a contrived, phony, fake event to promote a political agenda, where now acid attacks are undergoing an epidemic. In London alone, the number of attacks increased 73% in a year, from 261 in 2015 to 454 in 2016. In England and Wales, there were more than 400 recorded attacks in the 6 months prior to April. In fact, the UK has one of the world's highest rates of recorded acid attacks per capita. Think about it. Think about it. Acid attacks. We know gun control is not the solution. There are 5 million AR-15s in the U.S., but only 5 have been implicated in mass shootings. Sandy Hook, Las Vegas, and Parkland were 3 among them, which were staged for gun control. Chicago demonstrates gun control fails with soaring gun violence. The CDC, believe it or not, the Center for Disease Control, has been suppressing proof that the defensive use of gun usage far exceeds offensive use of gun shooting. This is a staggering statistic. There are 5 million AR-15s in the U.S., but only 5 have been implicated in mass shootings, and at least 3 of them have been fake attacks where AR-15s weren't actually used. Those are Sandy Hook, Las Vegas, and Parkland. They weren't, in fact, actually used there. Cook County's commissioner is now asking the UN to send in troops to quell Chicago's gun violence. Last weekend, no different than previous in Chicago, a gun control city, 16 were shot in the city's mean streets, killing 5, including a 15-year-old boy. It's been astronomical. Why? Because they banned guns. So it's a free fire zone. Remember, when you ban guns, it's only the law-abiding citizens who are restricted from weapons. The criminals who don't obey the law anyway aren't going to give theirs up. So they now have a free fire zone. Chicago is in Cook County in the state of Illinois. If a city's police are overwhelmed by and unable to contain its epidemic of homicides, the mayor should declare martial law. If that doesn't work, the state can send in its National Guard. If Illinois' National Guard is unable to deal with Chicago's homicide, the governor can ask for help from the federal government. But Cook County Commissioner Richard Boykin bypassed all the chain of command to go directly to the United Nations to seek to intervene. I mean, this is incredible. It turns out that the CDC has been suppressing the findings on defensive gun use. In 2008, as we know, in the landmark but razor-thin ruling of 5-4, the District of Columbia versus Heller, the court stated that the Second Amendment protects the individual's right to possess a firearm unconnected with service in a militia, and that to use that arm for traditionally lawful purposes such as self-defense within the home. In its ruling, SCOTUS even leaves open the possibility the individual's right to bear arms can include military-grade weapons, and we can see the reason why. Instead of supporting and upholding the Second Amendment, however, a federal agency, the Center for Disease Control, does just the opposite. Get this. A professor of criminology, Gary Kleck, has discovered that in 1996, 1997, and 1998, during the Clinton administration, the CDC conducted its own research on defensive gun use, but never released the findings or even acknowledged they had studied the topic. Not only did the CDC find a high incidence of defensive gun use of 2.46 million a year, the annual number of defensive gun use 3.6, about 4 times that of offensive gun use, which certainly reinforces the correctness of the Supreme Court's decision in 2008. To my dismay, even the editor of Esquire has been played. We got the 5 million AR-15s, only 5. These other stage CDC suppressing proof. What do we have? Esquire magazine. We really do want to take your guns. My note. Here's a guy, David Holmes, the editor-at-large of Esquire magazine, who's very smart, but does not appear to be aware that these school shootings are being staged to promote the DNC political agenda. He has no idea Sandy Hook, Las Vegas, and Parkland, for example, were orchestrated events. I am going to reach out to him and let him know that his advocacy is fine if it's based on true beliefs, but his instead appear to be based on false. And they are calling for gun confiscation. David Holmes is Esquire's Los Angeles-based editor-at-large. Absolutely stunning stuff. And I have written to him, had no response, but I hope he gets the message. School shootings have decreased since the 90s, but Democrats would like you to believe the opposite. In an early 2018 piece, Mises Wire editor Ryan Macon pointedly articulates the fact that U.S. government documents indicate a decline nationally in homicides and school shootings since the 90s, which means that schools are actually far safer than they were over 2 decades ago. Democrats and certain left-leaning media shills, however, would like you to believe the opposite, mostly because it promotes their gun control agenda. Murder is rising, but still below 1980 levels. This is another series of studies that support it. Although most school shootings end in homicide, that is, the ones who are reported. But when you subtract the fake, the whole situation changed dramatically. The number of homicides from school shootings is less likely today than it was decades ago, even if you added in the fake stage ones. 4 times the number of children were killed in schools in the 1990s than in today. I mean, this is stunning stuff. From a report by the U.S. Department of Justice, School Safety by the Numbers. What does the Maryland shooting tell us? Unlike the staged Parkland event, this one appears to have been real. A young man, depressed by breaking up with his girlfriend, shoots her. An armed security guard arrives, takes him out in less than a minute. Which warning will reduce the problem? Gun-free or armed security? Armed student dead after he shoots 2 others at Maryland High School, sheriff says. An armed student who shot 2 other students at Great Mills High School in Maryland Tuesday has died, according to St. Mary's County Sheriff Tim Cameron. The teenager used his father's legally owned handgun in an attack inside his high school in Maryland, police said Wednesday. Austin Rollins was killed Tuesday morning at Great Mills High School when a school resource officer fired off a shot at the attacker. Wasn't quite clear whether he took his own life or was killed by the officer. He was killed by the officer. Investigators with the St. Mary's County Sheriff's Office said Rollins shot a 16-year-old girl in the hallway within minutes of entering the high school. Rollins and the girl had recently ended a relationship. All indications suggest the shooting was not a random act of violence, police said in a statement. Well, let's review the bidding here. What didn't stop that school shooting? Maryland's assault weapons ban, Maryland's 10-round magazine limit, Maryland's universal background check requirement, Maryland's law requiring an exhaustive application process to obtain permit to purchase a handgun, Maryland's law prohibiting purchase of more than one handgun per month, Maryland's law requiring handgun registration, Maryland's law requiring licensing of handgun owners, Maryland's extremely limited approval of concealed carry permits, Maryland's refusal to honor any concealed carry permit from another state, federal law prohibiting handgun possession for people under 21, laws against carrying without a permit, gun-free zone laws, laws against discharging a firearm in public, laws against attempted murder. None of those made a difference. None. Maryland has them all. They didn't matter. They didn't make a difference. What did stop this school shooting? An armed person at the scene who engaged a shooter in less than a minute. Any questions? Which of these signs will prevent another tragedy? All weapons are prohibited on these premises, or staff heavily armed and trained. Any attempt to harm children will be met with deadly force. Now, I'm not suggesting having these body scanners, which appear to me to do damage to the human body. I am suggesting schools should have an armed security guard, depending on the size, a number appropriate. I also recommend that teachers ought to be authorized for concealed carry, because you can't tell what innovation is going to be taken. Even if you had, a metal scanner, they could come in through the roof or break in through a window if they were determined to conduct a shooting. These are fake. We want to be alarmed. We don't want to make the wrong response. We want to take reasonable measures for reasonable threats, but they've been grossly exaggerated. The threat to the Second Amendment, however, continues. Former Justice John Paul Stevens has recommended its abolition. Parkland students feel safer in Israel because it's an armed camp. Judge Napolitano got it right. It's to shoot tyrants, not to shoot deer. The ongoing process of the Stalinization of America has to be defeated. Let's review this. In the New York Times, no less, which we know now is a bastion of propaganda, publishes all kind of phony reports about every one of these fake shootings. You think that they don't have resources equal to or greater than the resources I and my colleagues possess? We're not even funded. We use the internet for research, but we sort it out. So the New York Times can't tell us these are staged and fake shootings. The New York Times, the Washington Post, CNN, NBC, MSNBC, you think with their vastly greater resources, they couldn't actually be telling the public the truth? They have no disposition. They're in on it. We have discovered 100 executives from CNN, all of whom are dual U.S.-Israeli citizens. We have 100 executives from NBC. They're all dual U.S.-Israeli citizens. We have 100 executives from the New York Times. They're all dual U.S.-Israeli citizens. There's a Zionist agenda here to weaken the United States. And just in case the point hasn't sunk in, Cynthia McKinney revealed years ago that when new members of Congress arrive in Washington, D.C., they're asked to sign a pledge to put the interests of Israel ahead of those of the United States. But where those who decline find themselves confronted with a well-financed alternative candidate, or even that their district has been redrawn and they no longer have a seat, Cynthia was able to overcome those obstacles, but even someone whom I regarded as the smartest member of Congress, Dennis Kucinich, was unable to. Gary King asked me recently, did I know how many members of the present Congress have refused to sign the pledge? I said no. Gary answered by holding up one finger of one hand, one member of Congress. Washington, D.C. is Zionist-occupied territory. The American people have to understand these people are not acting in our interest. They're acting in the interest of a foreign power. We had the absurd Mueller investigation. We hear constantly, we've heard for 18 months or more from CNN and MSNBC and the major networks about foreign nation interference in our election. Well, the facts of the matter is there was no Russian intervention. John Podesta and Robbie Mook made it up. within 24 hours of Hillary's concession speech. In order to divert attention from their incompetent campaign, from the contents of WikiLeaks, which led directly to Pizzagate, where John Podesta himself is the pedophile in chief, and to Hillary's own entanglements with Russia, where she, with the approval of President Barack Obama, sold 20% of U.S. uranium to Russia for a $145 million contribution to the Clinton campaign. And I say to you, if Julius and Ethel Rosenberg received the electric chair for sharing atomic secrets with the then Soviet Union, what do Hillary Clinton and Barack Obama deserve for selling off 20% of American uranium reserves to Russia for a $145 million bribe? There is intervention in our politics by a foreign power, but it ain't Russia. It is Israel. John F. Kennedy required the Jewish World Congress, the precursor of the American-Israeli, they call themselves Public Affairs Political Actions Committee, by far the most powerful lobby in Washington, D.C., to register as a foreign agent. But no president since his assassination has had the balls to do that. And when two distinguished scholars, one from Harvard, one from the University of Chicago, published a massive, thoroughly documented study of the Israeli lobby, is it received and praised by political figures on the left and the right? Does Congress pay attention and recognize the nature of the problem? No. What happens instead is they are vilified. They are marginalized. They are ridiculed, which is what's happening to those of us who are conducting conspiracy research, where we now confront the threat that Alex Jones is being targeted when there's no basis for it whatsoever. And some of us are simply apprehensive that Alex is going to take a fall. And because he's regarded as a preeminent conspiracy theorist, the public will conclude, well, if Alex Jones was wrong about Sandy Hook, how can we believe any of those in the conspiracy research community? Well, I'm telling you, I don't want Alex to do that. I hope it doesn't happen. I've written to his people. I've shared with them what we have about Sandy Hook. It's readily available, as you're finding out for yourself. I hope it doesn't happen. But there are those who are betraying us on the right and on the left, and the American people have to develop the intellectual fortitude to dig for the truth and not allow themselves to be played by the deep state and the media, which the CIA has been infiltrating since the 1950s in what's known as Operation Mockingbird, where already by 1975, William Colby, then its director, testified to Congress that the agency owns everyone of any significance in the media, and the situation has only become worse since, where it has been the internet that has made the difference. It is because there's so much research going on now that what took maybe 40, 50 years to crack with regard to JFK only took, say, 10 years to crack with regard to 9/11. It is taking lesser time, a couple of years for Sandy Hook, less time for the Boston bombing, less time for Charlottesville, less time for Parkland. I mean, it's happening, which is why they're cracking down on the internet. It is a violation of your right to freedom of speech. And let me just make the point. I believe that these massive social media giants like YouTube are indeed violating freedom of speech. Remember, it's dismissed on the ground they're private companies. But so were restaurants and hotels that discriminated against blacks. They were private companies before the Civil Rights Act. It has to be an extension thereof that private companies are no more entitled to violate the rights of American citizens in relation to freedom of speech and freedom of the press. Then private companies were entitled to violate the rights of black citizens before the Civil Rights Act enforced those rights. It has to happen because the future of the nation hangs in the balance. Here we have a worthy, no less than John Paul Stevens, former Associate Justice, proposing that we should repeal the Second Amendment, which shows that even a former justice of the Supreme Court can have his head where the sun does not shine, can be completely wrong about a matter of the greatest magnitude of importance to the American people. We have Parkland students rallying in Israel and Dubai to demand gun control in America. This is unbelievable. Get this, we had a couple of students from Parkland go to Israel for a visit, and she's reported, people say Israel is so unsafe. But the truth is, when I walk in the halls of Israel, I don't have the same fear I have walking now in the halls in my school, in what is supposed to be one of the safest cities in the country. But she ignores the fact that Israel is an armed camp. Every citizen of Israel goes through Israeli Defense Force training. They're all trained with weapons. One of the most calamitous decisions in recent American history was Richard Nixon abolishing the draft. He did it for a short-term political rationale to take the wind out of the anti-war movement. But Americans need to be trained with weapons. We need to restore the draft. It had the effect of leaving American families unconcerned about decisions of war and peace because they knew someone else would do it, their own sons and daughters would be at risk. We have to restore the draft to restore the integrity of this nation. These young people are out campaigning for gun control don't know, anything about weapons. They don't even know the difference between an automatic and a semi-automatic weapon. They've never fired weapons. They've never had any instruction in gun safety. They literally don't know what they're talking about. I say this as a former Marine Corps officer who supervised 15 DIs and 300 recruits going through marksmanship training, which was one of the ways I could tell that this alleged shooting at Sandy Hook, where the kill-to-target ratio was phenomenal, was absurd, being attributed to a 120-pound, six-pound student who was allegedly lugging around 35 pounds of gear and had no previous training. Even the Bureau of Alcohol, Tobacco, and Firearms official responsible for investigating admitted there was no evidence he had any marksmanship training at all. It was obvious to me and other experts that that was a fantasy. Well, what we're getting here is more of a fantasy, even from students from Parkland. As this article observed, women walk around casually with AR-15 rifles in Israel because they know what they're doing. Judge Napolitano got it right. Our right to AR-15s under the Second Amendment isn't for the purpose of shooting deer. It's for the purpose of shooting tyrants, for keeping this nation free, which is exactly the vision of the Founding Fathers. Here's a classic historical example. Resistance to Nazi oppression was hampered by the lack of civilian arms possession. One of the most notable exceptions was the Warsaw Ghetto Uprising of 1943, which began with a few incredibly brave Jews armed with handguns. They were able to temporarily stop deportation of Jews to Nazi extermination camps. There's more to be said about it, but there's no question whatsoever that had they been armed, they would have been in a completely different situation. David Hodges of the Common Sense Show has made very significant observations. This from a recent blog of mine. The Parkland, Florida school shooting was one more in a seemingly endless string of fabricated events that appear to be designed to instill fear into the public to make it more amenable to manipulation to promote a political agenda, which, as Dave Hodges of the Common Sense Show has observed, has three stages. First, a massive assault on the First Amendment, covered by the use of private companies, namely the social media giants, Google, YouTube, Facebook, and Twitter, to remove critics of official accounts from publicizing or sharing their research. Second, a correlated attack on the Second Amendment, where the University of Hawaii's Democide Project has shown there were 19 genocides during the 20th century, each of which was preceded by gun confiscation, leaving the population helpless to resist. And third, the extraction of dissidents, the critics, those who speak out against fake news, propaganda, and censorship, who must be removed because they pose a threat to the deep state and can inspire others to stand up for their rights and transfer to American gulags which we know as FEMA camps. That the removal of guns from law-abiding citizens is not in the interest of the American people, follows from studies that show that gun ownership and homicide rates are inversely related, which means that the greater gun ownership, the lower the homicide rate, as multiple studies have shown. John Lott, The War on Guns, makes a very good read about what's really going on here. And I say to the American people on the occasion of Memorial Day 2018, don't allow yourself to be played. Guns are important to the American people at 3 different levels of security: personal and family security, social and community security, and national security. You have individuals such as a fellow named Eric Swalwell in the 15th District in California, who is actively advocating the confiscation of weapons from all Americans at gunpoint if necessary. How outrageous can you get? This is a member of Congress who swore an oath to preserve, protect, and defend the Constitution of the United States. Eric Swalwell and others who are advocating gun control are traitors to the United States. They don't believe in the Constitution. Their allegiance lies elsewhere. And I say and emphasize on Memorial Day, as the University of Hawaii's Democide Project demonstrated, there have been 19 genocides in the 20th century, each of which was preceded by gun confiscation. Don't let the United States become number 20. Have a great Memorial Day, and God bless the USA.